So again, welcome everyone, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. It's early morning for me here in Michigan in the US. And so my name is Dr. Nicole Truesdell. I'm an educator and have been a research associate with Black Southwest Network since 2009. And I will be your facilitator for this event today. So why are we here today? So today we're gathered here today for the launch of the Research Action Coalition for Race Equality, or for short, RACE Coalition, which is a collaboration between Black Southwest Network, BSWN, and the University of Bristol that was established to support the development of more evidence-based approaches to influence policy on race disparity, right? No small feat right here. So over the course of the next 2 hours, what you're going to do is you're going to hear more about what race is and its intended aims from various speakers who are engaged with the coalition in one aspect or another. Now, as you can see, this is a webinar style event. This is a little bit new for me facilitating, so let's roll with this here, y'all. So all you're going to be able to see are the speakers who are on the panel on your screen, okay? So while people are speaking, I highly encourage you all to write your comments or questions in the chat as we proceed, because all feedback is welcome to help in the work of race going forward. Now, starting off, I'll provide a little bit more context for how we arrived here today. And afterwards, you're going to hear from Dr. Saffron Carlson from the University of Bristol, who will speak more about what race is and the current projects underway. Now, from there, we're going to go to our keynote speaker, Dr. Arathi
Sriprakash. That's
Sriprakash. Thank you, Arathi. I'm telling you, this is my biggest fear. Sriprakash, who's going to give us a really awesome but short talk on the role of data in enabling a shift to power that will then open up the larger discussion with the rest of our 12 panelists who come from various community organizations and academic departments in the city. Okay. And so the discussion today really is an opening, right? It's a beginning of bringing together community organizations and academics focused on race equality through data collection and analysis. Now, this is also a sticky subject, right? With a long history that leaves a bad taste in many folks' mouths. And rightfully so, when many BAME communities are some of the most overly researched groups in the country, yet have some of the least amount of ownership and access to that data. And the data itself seems to never have the impact it should in the communities being researched. And many times that's due to the fact that those analyzing the data do not come from the researchers, from the communities impacted. So essentially, racism impacts how we use and understand data on racism. Or as Sarah Ahmed tells us, evidence about racism and sexism is not believed many times because of the racism and sexism embedded in the structures to begin with. Right? And so we're trying to do things here a little bit differently. And what we're saying is we can't do work on racism if we don't take an explicit anti-racist lens. And this is the perspective Seydou Jurdi, director of BSWN, took when trying to come up with a more effective way to research on race and racism and have that impact the communities that are actually affected by race and racism. Now, BSWN has always conducted research as part of our work. It's what drives our recommendations for policy and our work within communities. Yet it has taken years, honestly decades, to have our work accepted in quote unquote mainstream areas because of where the data collection comes from, a BAME-led and focused organization. So instead of fighting, Seydou instead shifted to thinking about what partnering with institutions that are known for the data collection, universities, could look like on a more equitable footing. So some of the key questions Seydou had were, how do we build with communities via a race equity perspective and not just reproduce the same old community-based research? How do we use an anti-racism framework in that research? How do we shift power to the community so that they are not overly researched, but actually have a say in what is being researched? How do we decide what questions are asked and who asks them? And how do we change research and academic practice so that knowledge is not one way, but actually reciprocal in nature, right? So again, that's why we're here today, to launch a new coalition between community organizations and academics that is focused on co-production and co-creation through an anti-racist lens. And what this means is that we have to ask and answer the hard questions around power and knowledge production first. so that we set a stronger foundation rooted in racial equality and liberation, and not Band-Aid fixes that maintain the status quo. So our group discussion following our keynote speaker will dive into this by focusing on this power and knowledge production via data collection and analysis, right? And this is a conversation to help us enact anti-racist praxis, which is all it means is practice and theory together, by starting with the issues that have prohibited these partnerships to begin in the first place. So mainly extractive relationships and the collection, usage, and storage of research about race and racism that doesn't get to the communities being impacted. So we have to question the assumptions we have about the work, our partners and partnerships, and ourselves. To embed an anti-racist lens from the beginning means we acknowledge and believe in the ways that power operates in a racist society and how we are all influenced by that.
Like upgrade.
Oh, excuse me, I don't know who happened. And one could say actually corrupted by that understanding and practice of power. So to co-produce through an anti-racist lens requires a shift in the ways power is defined and enacted, to be truthful and honest about how power has been operating, and then creating plans from that reality, and not the illusion of what we think we are hoping to be and what we wish were already enacted. So then how do we move past critique and ownership of knowledge, for that is the mechanism of the state and its disciplining of the intellectual to be an academic? How do we move past internalized deficit-based thinkings of ourselves and our communities, when as community organizers and activists, that is the role you've been disciplined into performing by the state in order to be seen by the state and be eligible for its scraps, which usually means some funding and maybe be seen as a quote unquote viable partner. So an anti-racist practice and entails us starting here with the hard questions that allows us to pull apart the racist power structures that always operating, and ensuring we are embarking on an action-led journey that puts us in right relationships with ourselves, one another, and larger communities in the land that we interact with. And this for us becomes a kind of beginning part of how we really embed an anti-racist praxis into the coalition work we're trying to do today. And so I'm going to stop there and say I'm excited to hear from those speaking today. And so we're going to shift the perspective and turn to what exactly race is and what it's currently doing, by turning now to Dr. Saffron Carlson, who is the academic partner with the Race Coalition for the University of Bristol. So I'm going to stop here, and Saffron, go ahead and you can begin.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Nicole. Now I am going to hopefully start by sharing my screen. So hopefully you can see that. There we go. Oh, yes. Okay, right. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nicole, for that really fabulous introduction. Welcome everybody to this, this event. So it's a pleasure to welcome you here today to officially launch our new initiative, the Research Action Coalition for Race Equality. So I'm not planning on taking up too much of your time. I'm sort of going to build on some of the things that Nicole has already said. But we thought it would be useful to start off by giving you an introduction to the race. But I wanted to start by saying that obviously, as Nicole has explained, and as you'll see from the sort of information and the agenda and the structure for today, that we're going to have panels, we're going to have speakers. We'll have people that we will hear from more than others today. But I sort of wanted to start by saying that actually, much as there may be certain voices that are prioritised through this event, that actually none of you are here, or we don't see any of you here as simply being an audience, this sort of group of people who are absorbing these things that we say without actually playing any part in this coalition and how we take this forward. Because every one of you on this call could have a really instrumental role to play in the success of this project. And I hope that over the course of this event, you'll really see the value in doing so, in adding this coalition to the list of all the other important things that you do as part of your work and your lives. So the aim of this launch is to tell you about our plans and also what we're doing to put some of those wheels in motion. And it's for us to all talk about why this coalition could be a valuable addition to what we currently have. But mostly I see this event as an invitation really for you to join us. So we all have a common aim, everybody on this call, to end the inequalities that exist between different racialised groups. Obviously, many of you are already doing really brilliant work to make a difference to this. But we also know that there are often barriers to this work, simply caused by not having the information that you need. So sometimes it's because this evidence just simply doesn't exist, or it might be because it isn't available in ways which are actually useful. And as Nicole has already sort of expressed, the reason why we often find ourselves in these situations is largely because there are certain voices that get lost in the research process. So through this coalition, we really want to sort of shift some of these ways of working. Because ironically, it's often the voices who know more about what needs to be done, how best to do it, and how best to use what we find out as a result that are getting excluded. So academic research tends to assume that the getting of the information itself is the end of this process. So often as academics, we write our papers and then we tell each other about them, and it doesn't really tend to go very much further than that. But to me, this misses what could be sort of academia's greatest contribution to actually support the people who are working to change this reality, to listen to them about what they need and to help make that happen. And that's very much what this coalition is about. So we want to work together to use this coalition to help us work together more effectively and ensure that we're always listening to each other in ways that recognise that there's something valuable that we all bring to the table, and making sure that we make the most of the opportunities that this offers. So we want to develop a culture of partnership and co-creation to make research more meaningful and more useful and more accessible to those who need it. We want to connect research to community-led approaches, so recognising, valuing and responding to communities' lived experiences and diverse forms of knowledge and expertise. So doing this through partnership and collaboration and co-production between academics, community groups, policymakers, any of us that are working on this agenda around sort of ending race inequalities, particularly in the region. So we're looking to use this coalition to develop a sort of shared partnership space where we can ensure that we're able to produce research which responds to the needs of anyone working to achieve race equality in the region. So we've already started mapping some of the existing evidence on race inequalities in the region, finding out where it is, finding ways to get hold of it and make it useful. But we need to hear from you about how the best ways to present it so that you can use it, so that you can get the most out of it for the things you're trying to achieve. And we also need to hear from you about what other evidence you need, so the specific questions that you need answering, so that we can work together to decide how best to achieve that and actually make that happen. So Angelique and Sade will talk to you a little bit later on about how we've started this ball rolling, and also the different ways that we might work together through this coalition. But we need to share the power to make decisions over what research we do and how we do it, and also how best to work that into policy and practice to make significant, long-lasting change. So there are no spectators here. From this moment, I hope that you'll join us in this coalition of people, of activists, community workers, policymakers, practitioners, academics, however you define yourself. We all have information to share. We all have an opportunity to learn from each other. Together, we can better identify the problems and the solutions and make them happen. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Saffron. So that is the beginning of what race is, a concept that is a coalition. And so to situate this and why this even matters and why we're here, we're going to now turn to Arathi, and what she's going to do is give us a presentation on the importance of data and why data is both centered in this work around race equality, and how data then can become a location and space for actual justice making projects. So take it over, Arathi.
Thank you, everyone. And Nicole, can you give me a quick nod if you can see my screen, my slides there? Yep, great. Thank you so much. So thank you for having me along to this important launch of the Race Action Coalition for Research Action Coalition for Race Equality. It's a real honor to be here. So my name is Arathi Sriprakash. I'm a sociologist of education based at the University of Bristol. And much of my work has been interested in the politics of knowledge production, particularly how education systems are implicated in perpetuating colonial and racial understandings of the world. So the theme of data, power, and racial justice that I've been asked to reflect on today with you all is something that's very close to my heart. But I'm also here because I'm excited to learn about the work that folks here are doing and planning, particularly as someone who's relatively new to the city of Bristol. I'm zooming in from Knoll today, from South Bristol, and I'm really keen to listen, connect, and take up that invitation of Saffron's before, and hopefully with you all to get involved with the Race Coalition. So thank you so much for having me. Let me try to. Great. So today I'm going to reflect on some concepts to think about the relationship between data, power, and racial justice. But I want to start with quite a concrete and grounded example that you'll probably mostly all be familiar with, and that is the recent publication of the CRED report, the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities report led by Tony Sewell. As many of you would have followed, the CRED report was part of an ideological project of the current government to minimise and deny the severity and systemic nature of racism in this country. Working across public policy domains from education, health, and crime and policing, the report presented what it claimed as data and evidence, largely to lay the blame of disparities with particular racialised groups. And I want to name here that the undercurrent of anti-Blackness in this report was particularly forceful. The report is, in some ways, a study on the relationship between data, power, and racial justice. It used the language of evidence to create policy priorities. But what exactly is the basis of this so-called evidence? As numerous academics and community experts critiqued in the wake of the report, it selectively used data, it misrepresented research that does occur across policy fields. In fact, it overlooked huge swathes of that research, and it systematically ignored the testimonies of the lived experiences of racism in this country. And in this sense, it's a classic example of what scholars have called testimonial injustice. So the headline that I've pasted on this slide is from The Guardian, and it was reporting on how actually a considerable number of people gave evidence to the Race Commission to say how the UK is systematically racist, yet this evidence was simply ignored and omitted. And it's why so many people felt gaslighted and angered by that report, because of that testimonial injustice. So lots of things arise out of this. I'm going to talk about two things that I've been thinking about in relation to today's talk and the work of the Race Coalition. First, given that data, knowledge, evidence, and testimonies of racial injustices do sometimes already exist, though I do take the point that Saffron made about sometimes we don't have enough evidence or the kinds of evidence that might help such work. But given that there is evidence out there, we only have to listen to those testimonies, to that knowledge, to that data, to read that research and listen to communities. But so the question is, how does all of this become so willfully ignored by those in power? So how can communities speak back through data to that willful ignorance and hold those in power to account? And I'm going to talk about this through the lens of data surveillance, which I'll explain in a second. The second question that arose for me after the CRED report is that in light of this gross exercise of power, what are the kinds of knowledge and data that we should be trying to generate and support for the direct benefit of communities themselves, given this report seemed to be dismissive, really, of those testimonies and stories. So how can we think about the use of data and support those things for the direct benefit of communities themselves, and how might these be done? What are the ethics involved in doing this? And again, Saffron was talking about this being key principles of the Race Coalition. So I'm going to be pointing to some of these ethical questions that I know that are at the heart of the Race Coalition's work. Questions such as, what is the purpose of data generation? Who is it for? Who owns it? Who accesses it? And there's lots of entry points into having these conversations. So just one of those entry points that I'm going to offer today is about the idea of data sovereignty. Okay, so the first idea that I want to explore is on this term surveillance. If we think about how our lives are governed by various means of surveillance, including the gathering of data to help shape public policy, what happens if we turn this on its head? Sur in surveillance means from above. So surveillance refers from below. It is knowledge gained from undersight, not oversight. And in doing it, it disrupts the relations of power in data generation and knowledge production processes. Key to the idea of surveillance is the idea that data or knowledge is generated from the observations and recordings of an entity who is not in a position of power or in a position of authority over the subject of the research or of the gaze of data collection exercises. And I think this is why, the intentions of partnerships and co-production is so central to the work that the Race Coalition is doing. And this can take lots of different forms. We can think about citizen-led or crowdsourced research, monitoring and evaluation. Actually, one very topical way that surveillance has entered into thinking about disrupting forms of power, particularly against state violences, is using cameras or wearable tech to monitor things like police violence and so on. That can be a form of surveillance as well, from below. In my own research, something that I've been looking at with colleagues is developing what we've been calling an invisible labor app, an app that can help workers track unseen and unrecognized works explicitly to better understand the production of workplace inequalities and think about the production of the ethnic and gender pay gaps. So that's one way. So those sorts of tracking apps might be another example. But actually what I want to underline here is not the specifics of those sorts of projects, but the potential for such a concept of turning the gaze back of surveillance to enable possibilities of holding to account the very ignorances and denials and blind spots around racism, such as those that we saw in the CRED report. And this slide that I've put together here, I've linked a couple of examples of data justice labs that, whilst they don't frame their work explicitly around the terms of surveillance, they're actually actively creating what we can understand as alternative archives to document and call out systems of racial oppression. And the image that you can see on this slide is actually taken from a US-based anti-eviction mapping project that documents both the extent of evictions, in this case in California, as well as the mapping of testimonies and narratives of displacement, those lived experiences, which become powerful new bases of evidence to inform collective action. And the second idea I wanted to share with you all is on the concept of data sovereignty. I've been particularly inspired by the Indigenous data sovereignty movement, who some of you might be aware of, including the transnational network of Indigenous scholars and activists called the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, or GIDA. And I've put the website on this slide. The Indigenous data sovereignty movement emerges from a recognition that there is an enormous body of data about Indigenous people, but almost no data for or by Indigenous people. And it's explicitly, the movement and the principles of Indigenous data sovereignty is explicitly against the deficit framing of Indigenous communities. And this is something that Nicole mentioned in her opening remarks. So there have been pervasive deficit framings of marginalized, oppressed communities, including Indigenous communities, precisely because of the colonial knowledge systems and racialized knowledge systems that guide our understanding of what counts and whose knowledges counts and so on. And it's this kind of deficit that we saw so strongly, again, in that CRED report. It attributed disparities across health, education, so on, to practices within communities. So there was a kind of blaming of communities instead of thinking about the structural disadvantages that might lead to those sorts of inequalities. So basically what happens is that there's a form of cultural racism. So the Indigenous data sovereignty movement is trying to directly challenge that kind of deficit framing. And they do this through challenging data that is centered around what they call the 5 Ds: difference, disparity, disadvantage, dysfunction, and deprivation. And there is a rich literature here that, I've put one paper by Maggie Walter and Michelle Suina, but there's much that's been written about in books, including in the University of Bristol Library, around the Indigenous data sovereignty movement. So if we can think about what it is then, what Indigenous data sovereignty is, it's defined by the right to determine the means of collection, access, analysis, interpretation, management, dissemination, and reuse of data. So it's not just a one-time kind of thing about having a partnership and extracting and off you go. It's actually thinking about knowledge production across the whole cycle. And I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, but I just wanted to talk through very quickly the acronym of CARE that you see here on collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility and ethics. On the GITA website here, there is actually a wealth of research literature, open access on the CARE principles that have been developed to guide the work on data sovereignty. So just very briefly, and of course it's worth kind of reading and thinking with much more deeply and over some time, but collective benefit refers to the data ecosystems that need to be designed and function in a way that enable Indigenous people to derive benefit from the data. So thinking much more in terms of data ecosystems, which helps us get at that kind of life cycle. The authority to control, which refers to Indigenous people's rights and interests in Indigenous data, that this must be recognized and they must have authority to control how data is used, also particularly how Indigenous lands, territories, resources, knowledges are represented and identified in data. The R stands for responsibility, and those working with Indigenous data have a responsibility to share how those data are used to support Indigenous people's self-determination and collective benefit. And this accountability requires meaningful and openly available evidence of those efforts, right? So really documenting as well the process of research. And the E in CARE stands for ethics. Indigenous people's rights and well-being should be the primary concern at all stages of the data life cycle and across the data ecosystem. So anyway, with those resources and reflections, I'll close here. Of course, these aren't the only way to think about data, power, and racial justice, but I hope that these reflections and these perspectives on what some other coalitions are doing might offer fruitful ideas for our collective work going forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Before we open it up for the full panel, Arathi, I had a couple of questions based upon what you said, because it was really interesting, this idea of data ecosystems, right? And we're talking about that in relation to rethinking what data collection means, right? Through a race equality, anti-racist lens, with race equality being the end goal. So what would data ecosystems, just off the top of your head, what would that look like, right? In this kind of, in a Bristol context, in a UK context, where we're trying to bridge this kind of divide between academic and community organizations with the expressive goal to start to enact actual racial equity in spaces that don't even want to see it.
Yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, it's getting us to think about all the sorts of infrastructures, but also relationships that might inform the research process. So in terms of infrastructures, that's also things like what sorts of conditions are made possible for equitable partnerships to even occur, you know, the material requirements for that. And that often becomes invisible, you know, the costs of doing research, the cost to communities as well. What are the expectations and how are we actually allowing, I mean, I think the question that, the really important question that Saffron alerted to is whose voices are getting lost in the research. So it's those ecosystems that are kind of trying to tune us into making sure that voices don't get lost. And what do we need for that? We need infrastructures and conditions to enable that to happen. It's hard because I think each project or initiative will have specific ways and what like that can look like different things in different places, right? So it's hard for me to give a kind of template exactly of what that might mean, but it could be small things around is the time being accounted for in ways or you know, in terms of material contributions for participants who are fatigued, potentially if community members are fatigued from extractive models of research, then what is actually being done here to ensure that it's not yet another model of extraction and those sorts of things. So I think that could be a really interesting question for us to think about across the specific projects. Like, what would this ecosystem look like? So it's not just about the individual researcher or even a group of researchers going into communities and extracting ideas, but what are the kinds of things we would need to build those ecosystems and those infrastructures before we even have that relation, that sort of engagement.
Great, and that's a great way to open it up now for everybody, because I think what you're ending with is having to have the conversation about what is actually needed on both sides, and how do we then come together and think about well, based upon what all the different sides needs, how do we then meld together, right? So how do we create the ecosystem spaces that have been dispersed, and how do we bring that all together, right, for an end goal? So now I want to open it up for the rest of the panel then, so let's have the same question. And what I want to do is, for those who are listening in, the panelists, as they speak, they will say their name, and I will have their bios, as I've had the last two speakers, in the actual chat. So you'll read more information about each speaker as they come on. But I ask all the speakers on the panel, as you unmute yourself, please speak. Just please say your name so we can hear your name and where you're from, and then answer the question. And so what we're going to do is take that ecosystem question and really ask, what would this look like? How do we build from both an academic and community standpoint? What do you see as the needs of building a kind of a system that allows various actors to come together to actually work on this kind of end goal of co-produced, co-relational data that can lead to race equality? So that's a big question, but I'm gonna open it up. And as you are speaking, I will be putting your bios in the chat. So who would like to tackle that one first? Kalpana, go ahead. And please don't raise your head. You can go ahead and unmute and just go ahead and talk.
Oh, hello. Yes, I'm Kalpana Wolf. Yes, a very, very interesting conversation so far. And I think this ecosystem, it absolutely requires work on both sides. What we have at the moment, this ecosystem that exists at the moment, is that we have a community that is fatigued, basically, by being asked lots of questions and being offered, being asked regularly questions about their lives, their lived experiences, and they're not hearing anything at all about that. And of course, that is considered a type of taxation as far as I'm concerned, because people are busy, but they give a lot of time and effort to research because they often believe that this is going to hopefully make a difference. So I think on the community side, it really is about, actually, we've got to come with a truth and saying that, what is this research going to achieve? Where do the communities sort of belong in this? Where is this sort of like, where is this how will the evidence be used, and what power do they have as well? Because I think apart from fatigue, communities feel just very sort of disempowered by all of this. And then that also breeds mistrust. I think when I talk to my communities, what they say is that the researchers come with already a view of what they think the answer is. And we see this all the time. So I think looking at the other side of the ecosystem, the academics, the researchers, you know, how do we get those researchers to really start afresh? And I think a lot of training, I'm afraid, needs to be done by that, because the people who are in those positions, that's not going to change for quite a long time. We look at our universities, the people who get research projects, because it's all to do with money, are not people who have done much work in the community or connected with the community, don't not necessarily come from the community that they're researching in. So that, I think there's a real piece of work that's got to be done around those people, and that, because it is about decolonizing. It's about, you know, understanding culture. It's about privilege. So there's quite a bit of work that needs to be done with that. Because otherwise, when you bring the two together, it's just not going to work. So I think I'd say there really is that. Then I think there's something about this feeling of participation, this co-creation, co-production has to be embedded and felt, that the communities need to feel that this is really, there's an honesty there, that it's genuine, but it can't happen unless the academics and researchers really understand. I see many times where researchers and academics already have an answer in their mind, and they build the research around that. So basically, they don't have they're not even equipped to listen. Then finally, I'd say is that when I've seen research being put together, it's often put together as a proposal without having done the work with communities. So if you put your proposal together for when you're trying to get funding, you already are saying what the outcomes are going to be potentially. So there's an issue there as well. So that's what I'd say, that really at the beginning, I mean, there's a lot more, but these are the things that I hear from communities as well, and that I see regularly.
Can I
Thank
just
you.
come in there?
Go ahead, Desmond.
Yeah, Desmond Brown, independent chair of the Lamb Review for Avon and Somerset. I just wanted to pick up on that idea of ownership and trust. I mean, trust is within the criminal justice system is the main point that is lacking from communities. And David Lammy said that activity shouldn't be confused with measurable outcomes. And I think that idea of trust, and what Carlton is saying, and other speakers have talked about, that data sovereignty and ownership, there is a real lack of trust that it even belongs to them. And at kind of top levels, as Carlton has kind of alluded to, it's a feeling of being done to. You know, if we look at lumping together, you know, Matt Hancock was asked in an interview how many Black people he had in his cabinet. He came back and said, well, there's plenty of Black and minority ethnic people. If you actually look, he wasn't lying, but there were no people of African heritage. So he wasn't lying, but this lumping together of data. So as a beginning, I think, you know, the conversations around terms that we use, you know, we have to remember that data collection is a very colonialist idea in England, and how data is collected is very much categorizing people. So I think ownership over how the terms are used, and it's not a quick solution, and I wouldn't want it to be. I think those conversations have started within communities, but they need to be resourced and carried on. And I think that data sovereignty is really important. Yeah, and you know, fair treatment comes from decision making being open to scrutiny. And I think again that we need to find ways of driving this data that we've got at local level. I really feel that we're kind of caught in this loop of reviews going on, data being collected. As Kalpana said, people get tired of their data being collected because they don't see any measurable change or outcome from that data being collected. So I think that there needs to be real a push at changing some of these things that we've known for 20 years that are happening. Communities are tired of telling people the same thing. If you look at the Stuart Hall Foundation report that talks about 20 years since the Scarman report of the 13 reviews that have taken place around race in this country, out of those 589 recommendations, 385 are still to be completed. David Lammy's review, of those 35 recommendations, we're still waiting for them to be implemented 4 years after that review. And in some cases, things have got backwards. If you look at my area of criminal justice, you know, over a quarter of the population in prison are from BAME backgrounds. You know, in 2000, when the first review of prisons took place, this was at 18%. And things have slipped backwards with great, you know, the 2008 review into prisons came up with very challenging and transparent issues around prisons. If we look at them now, and the Zayed Mubarak Foundation, if you look at, we have slipped, all those initiatives are no longer taking place. So it's really important that, number one, that communities also engage, because I think that lethargy means the fingers need to be pointed back to the community, because it won't change unless we take part in the ownership of the data and actually delivering the findings.
Yes, and go ahead, Michael. Oh, we can't hear you. There's some bad feedback. Michael, let me go to Leon and then let's see if you can fix it in the meantime, okay? If that works. I'm gonna go to Leon and then while you see if you can fix your focus. Perfect. Go ahead, Leon, and then we'll come back to you, Michael.
Thank you. Just to kind of add on from what Kalpana and others were saying earlier about the research process, I think there's also a job of work to be done, an educational job of work to be done around how we interpret data, particularly data that appears complex to people who aren't used to interpreting data. An example would be, you know, the recent Sewell report, which, like, you know, several other government reports, you know, has created an impression through the manipulation of data that in fact our Black and minority ethnic people aren't subject to racism. Now, of course, there are political issues around that report, which we need to deal with directly. But there are also issues to do with the way that the data is presented that helps to obfuscate the interests underlying the report. So, for example, in the presentation of quantitative data, you know, the idea that you can somehow neatly control for class in a way that shows that it's only our Black Caribbean learners that are in fact underperforming worse than the white working class learners, you know, is hugely problematic, because it's not easy, however confident Sewell might be in presenting this as a case, it's actually not so easy to do that. You can't, because race and class are so implicated, that race is so bundled up in the way that class is created in the first place. Socioeconomic disadvantage is reproduced through education, through other structures. We need to develop the understanding where people can have the confidence to say, hang on, you know, you're pulling the wool over my eyes here, mate. You know, Tony, you can't say that, you know, that's not legitimate to say. And in the same way, you know, I'm again using the Sewell report as an example, the way that they dismiss lived experience. What they're doing is dismissing, it's a testimonial injustice. They're basically saying that research that's usually qualitative of nature, that tries to capture the complex realities that people have on a day-to-day basis of racism in their lives somehow is illegitimate. Somehow it doesn't stack up compared to their flawed quantitative data. So I think there's a job of work to be done around how we can educate ourselves as a community to look behind the data and to interrogate it critically. Thank you.
Thank you, Leon. And then Michael, do you want to try it again before we continue on? Oh, no, I'm so sorry. No, it's like a static on the back. Well, let's see if we can take the headphones off. Maybe that'll work. If we disconnect. Let's try again. No, I'm so sorry, Michael. No, okay. Maybe you can type what you want to say a little bit and I can speak it out until we can fix this on your end. Okay, thank you. Yes. Anyone else want to comment from based upon, because there's a running theme from the last few speakers about this idea of evidence and what is considered evidence and how it's presented. And something that's come up a lot is this idea of what actually is allowed to be presented as being legitimate. And we're seeing that lived experience and the qualitative, the voice, the stories are somehow illegitimate in talking about a human experience. So it's weird, right? Researching on a human experience, the actual human part of it is then deterred and not taken as actual evidence for the inhumanity being expressed. So how do you grapple with that, right? How do you, as a coalition, how do you think you're going to grapple with this idea of what you all define as the needed evidence, right, to support the work in what you want to do, when that evidence itself, as we've been seeing over and over again, is what is being disproven as actually being the evidence needed to show that there is racism? Does that make sense, y'all? It's really convoluted. So how do you think you're going to work through that as a coalition when you know the evidence that you already have and can collect is not what those in power right now will actually see as justification? We have silence.
Well, I've just spoken, so I'm a bit reluctant to speak again, because I want to give everyone else a chance. But I think there's a job of work to be done, as I think I may have mentioned, in terms of, you know, an educational project we should be doing with our communities around how we make sense of this kind of, you know, the kind of stuff that comes out of the Sewell report. So we can sit down with our communities and say, because, you know, if you're an anti-racist activist in the community and you see something like the Sewell report coming along and telling you that the thing you've been struggling against all your professional life doesn't actually exist, then, you know, there's a job of work to be done in interpreting and analysing, understanding that data, that we, people who are used to handling quantitative data and can understand how it's being manipulated, because it's not neutral. I mean, the indicators, for example, that people use when they try to make out that it's actually the white working class that are the so-called oppressed group, you know, are often really dubious. For example, you know, in many instances, they equate white working class with people who are eligible for free school meals. They didn't do that in the case of the Sewell report, but in the Timpson report, which was about school exclusions, they did that. And they've done that in lots of other reports. And it's wrong because, of course, you know, that's a small fraction of the people that would identify as white working class. You know, so it leads to a total misrepresentation of the issues. So things like that, you know, we need to be able to sit down with each other and talk about this. You know, we can share expertise, and it's not people that happen to know about this kind of stuff telling everybody else. It's about sharing experiences and understandings.
Yeah, can I come in there? I mean, I totally agree with Leon. I think also the other issue is that commissioning bodies or organizations, I mean, in my case, it's the criminal justice system, I think also have to understand that having data isn't enough. It's the questions that need to be asked around that. You can answer any question with data. I think if you haven't got the right people there who are asking the right questions, and again, I think that goes back to the lived experience of people, because there are a lot of great organizations collecting a lot of data, but who don't understand what disproportionality is and haven't really got a clue about what to do it. So they've got the data, but no one's inquiring in a proper way that data to actually overcome some of the issues. So we go around in this kind of wash cycle of incident review reports, incident review report, where and the analysis of the data needs to be, and this is the challenge I think we need to go to organizations as well as the community, is the community need to be involved in this process if we're going to get anywhere, because we've had 40 years of data and lived experience, and we are falling backwards with some of the issues we've got, as Leon says, in schools and the criminal justice system. So, you know, it's imperative not just to go through the motions. There needs to be real engagement and understand that trust element with systems in this country, because of race and the disproportionality we've had, is a real issue. And, you know, it's just not good enough just to have systems. The inquiry of that data is as important as the collection of that data. And I think it needs to be people who understand what the lived experience is.
Thank you. And then Helen, I know you wanted to jump in here before we go to Kalpna as well as part of this conversation.
Thank you. Yes, sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I should just say I'm co-director of part-time programs at the University of Bristol. I do have a fantastic job share on board with that role as well. I just want to say that I think that co-production as a methodology in some ways provides us with a toolkit for some of the processes that can bring around change in the production of research, particularly in terms of framing everything we do with a sense of humility and bringing knowledge forward in ways that recognise that knowledge comes in different shapes and forms, and that together different forms of knowledge can affect change. The production of research that makes no use and purpose on the ground is a point of continued frustration for me, and actually why I entered academia from the charitable sector in the first place. And I think there's a real potential with methods that think about how we can bring community organisations, community members, academics together in producing knowledge is a starting point. And one of the things that really excites me about this panel and the coalition is to think about how we do that more systematically. And thinking about some of Leon Tickley's comments about how we engage community members in data analysis. Well, there's a real role for the University of Bristol and other academic institutes that are huge publicly funded educational bodies to be looking at how we deliver training as an embedded part of our research projects, how we train in community members so they leave a research project not just having been involved in the production of knowledge, but with the skills to go forward to do their own research and their own analysis in future. And I would be really excited to think about how we could set that as a new normative principle, that's a social justice aim for research projects that we're perhaps involved with going forward.
Thank you. Go ahead, Abdul, and then we're going to go to Kalpna. Go ahead.
Okay. Now, my name is Abdullah Farah. I work for a community organization. From the community perspective, I 100% agree with Kalpna. We have an apathy. We're tired of academics coming to us and collecting data and asking us to help them collecting data and then disappear, not coming back. And if we are lucky to get some report back, it is the report which data are cherry-picked, interpreted the way they were thinking before they came to us. Now, often questions are prepared and a proposal are already submitted, and it is have no use at all, whatever they produce, because it doesn't reflect exactly what we are dealing with locally or the need of the community that we are working with. So it's really, the way data interpreted, the way it's collected, the way even, not on the same level of basis, it is just academics. So with the knowledge and the power, coming into the community and asking questions, which some of them you can, you know, you don't have power to change those questionnaire they're coming with because they already know they design themselves. So it is really difficult to work with academics who want to collect the data from the community, because, you know, every other month or week, or somebody from the university contact, oh, I want to do this research in the community, and then they disappear or collect the data, which the only project I have seen of last 15 years that I'm working with the academics was a very small project that we did with the university, which we thought it was we were able to contribute, and at the start we were part of it. Well, it was very small, but it was useful, and we are still benefiting it. We're still using it. So if you know, whatever comes out with this project, it should be you know, it should start from same level and same you know, yeah.
No, and I think that draws completely in what Kalpana was saying. And Kalpana, you want to respond? Because I know your hand is up, and I think it's be a good way to bring those concepts together. Kalpana, do you want to go? Oh, yes, you. And then we'll go to yes.
No, thank you, Abdullah. That's absolutely true. Yeah, I think, you know, we talked about it, and you know, we see it every day in the community, Abdullah, and I think Michael would say the same, and Desmond, and so on. And I think, you know, we've got to redress this balance. You know, we've got this, you know, it's completely imbalanced the way it is, and if we're going to work as a coalition and we say, actually, we want this equality, we've got to understand, you know, both sides need to understand what equality is, and I'm afraid that I think there's a lot of work to be done around research institutions and around universities about understanding that. What is equality? What is anti-racism? And so I think a piece of work for everybody who comes and says they want to create some evidence or data with communities. Helen, that's absolutely right. It should be co-created, and it sounds very exciting what you're saying. But my issue is that actually we constantly get people who come from privileged backgrounds, but haven't, and that's fine, but they don't understand what it's like to have the lived experience, and they haven't, because they come with their biases. Everybody has biases, you know, but are they actually trained in understanding what their biases are? And so I think that you know, and I don't think we'll get this data sovereignty. We won't get data understanding. We won't get, Leon, this sort of being able to even question data properly, because when their CRED report happened, most people just felt incredibly disempowered. You know, they felt like we're already down, what, you know, right, give us a kick as well while you're at it. But they don't have, you know, they wouldn't go to somebody and say, how do I interpret this? Because they don't trust those institutions either. And we need to make sure those institutions and everybody who has who is able to get research grants, because it's all tied up with money as well. Research is all about money. It's about giving those people a place in their institution and in their organization and in their career. That is true as well. So our research is being used to elevate other people, you know, and I think that has to be questioned actually. When research is being funded, is it being funded in a way that's equitable, that, you know, that is actually that's going to come back and support and make a difference to people? These are really key things, and I'm really interested to hear what academics have to say about this. There's another thing I'd like to say, is that I sit on the governor's board for UWE, as well as sitting on the court for University of Bristol. And you might know that there's what they've been calling an attainment gap between students. So a white student who starts a university, and this is across all universities in the UK, and a black student, they will start with the same education, same qualifications, but will leave with different results. And the black student will leave with lower grades. And now they call this the attainment gap, the award gap, and it's a scandal. It's a scandal that's been happening, for a long time. So we've asked for a lot of data on that. There's a lot of data on it. The question for me is the people who are putting together the data, I feel they come putting that data together, thinking already with the bias, with the understanding, with the thinking that actually this is the way it's always going to be. That they're not thinking about actually what questions do I need to ask so we can drive some change. They're thinking, well, actually, for 30 years, black students have done worse. Well, we'll carry on coming at it the same way. So the perception, the bias, the privilege, the approach, that has got a lot of work to be done. And these are really brutal things that I want to talk about today, but this is the reality. And so that's education. You can talk about that in food poverty. You can talk about that every single aspect of what communities have to face. Despite the fact that a lot of data exists or a lot of research has been done. So that's what I'd like to say. And I think, this coalition is, if we can find solutions around that, because at the same time, we do know that institutions like University of Bristol have the ability to attract a lot of funding, a lot of research grants or possibilities that can make a real difference. But it is about redressing this and understanding what equality means.
Thank you, Kalpna. And I wanted to add in, Michael also had some comments alongside with this that I think actually work well. And then I'll turn to Hibo, is that correct? Is that good? So Michael was also saying that community sees researchers as quote unquote tourists coming in and take a snapshot of their lives and putting the pictures in an album to look at. And so Michael's saying that research needs to have as one of its outcomes the empowerment of the people it's requesting the data from. Is that fair, Michael, in terms of relationship to what you were saying with everybody else? Great, good. I'm going to get that voice in there. We're going to get it in. So Hibo, go ahead and continue the conversation. And then we'll go to Leon, then Desmond, and then we'll continue on.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Lots of great points have been raised. And I missed a little bit of it because my internet's playing up. But so yeah, I'm Hibo, Managing Director of Tala, a community-based organization in St. Paul's. So from a community perspective, what I would like to add is we've been, I guess, supporting, and I'm choosing my words quite wisely. I cannot say we have co-produced, but we've been supporting many institutions, different departments, some PhD students around their research in the past few years. And generally, our experiences have been positive. When I say positive, I mean they were quite amicable. In terms of, we were quite forward with what we could do, and if there was some research that maybe were not sort of in par with our values, then we would, politely decline to continue with those research. But what I can say from my experience really is that research, going forward, really need to, as others said, make sure to include community organizations within all the processes throughout, from the beginning when the funding is being drawn, to the end where actually the reports are sort of being published, and when there are events that are sort of there to publicize the report. And that is because the community organizations are at the forefront, and they are the ones who actually know from the beginning what are the main priorities, what are the issues from the get-go. And an example of this is back last year when COVID-19 first hit in the UK, within the first couple of weeks, community organizations knew that there was going to be food poverty. They knew that there was going to be digital poverty. They also knew that there was a need for some sort of education catch up. But all of that was not really taken into consideration within the first few weeks because no one was listening to the community organizations. But then after a few months or a good year afterwards, when that came from from the central government, when that came from famous celebrities, that's when people started to listen. So we really need to listen to our community organizations because they are the ones, with expertise. And also just a couple of things really is that, as I've said, we do need to draw on the strength, not to assume that things that have worked in the past can work now. For example, giving vouchers and just showing some token of appreciation, might not work for everyone. And also just to be aware that community organizations themselves, have a really hard time in terms of, there's a lot of pressure really. And when you ask community organizations to support them to look for participants, what you have to remember is that they are trusted people, trusted, in organizations in the community. And when researchers leave, and they will leave, it's the community organizations that are there, that are still dealing with, with the participants, and they are the ones who will be who will have to answer questions like, what were the findings of the report? Because people want outcome, that's what people want. The other day, I'm part of a community research actually, and the first question that I was asked when I was, when I started the consultation, the group session was, what will be the outcome of this research? So I think we also have to really, really focus on outcome-based research that will benefit the communities, within a short term as well, not just long term. Thank you.
Thank you. And I also wanted to add in here a comment from that actually completely coincides with what you're saying, and the other panelists, from Jessica, who's an academic also from marginalized community in Bristol. And what she's saying is that when she talks to people in the community, they don't have much interest in understanding reports like Swell's because, quite rightly so, they don't trust policymakers. So again, this trust comes up again, and are not surprised by the lies being spouted. So it's just a lie in the report, which makes sense to them. So it's not a point of engaging in that toxic narrative. So we keep hearing this kind of reiterative concept, and Leah, I'm gonna get to you next, and then Desmond, and your hands are up, that we're having this idea of trust and this idea that how the data is collected, what's considered data, then how it's written out and disseminated, all of that somehow has to be remade, right? Because the ways in which it's done now only align with and only support the agenda of the university, and which is very small, right? And we also have to recognize within the university, those who occupy marginalized identities are also facing this while they're then researching it, and then sometimes subconsciously or consciously enacting it so we're having all of these things interacting together, right, at the same time. So then what would, and Leon, Desmond, please answer the question you wanted to answer before, after this, but as we're thinking about it then, if we put aside and realize that the research, the data, how it's done, the way it's done, the mechanism in which it's done, it doesn't work for the goal that this group has based upon the experiences you all have had individually and collectively in your location, then what would that look like? So what do you want to collect? What are the questions you want to ask? How would you want to disseminate it? So if we already know what is and how it doesn't work, then what do you want to actually create? So I want your panelists to think about that as we continue this conversation with Leon and Desmond, and then I want to shift it into what could be possible now that we understand what ain't working and that people don't like what it is so far. Okay, so Leon, you go next.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to make a couple of practical suggestions, if I might. So one is, you know, in relation to this point that, and it keeps coming up in the chat about, you know, how undemocratic the research process is. You know, that, so, you know, who gets to define the focus of the research? Who gets the funding from the research to actually do the research? How are communities involved? Are they just passive objects of research, or are they actively involved in it? How is it disseminated? Is it disseminated in a way that ordinary people can understand as meaning for their lives, that they can take in and understand and act on? And, you know, maybe one thing that this group might think about might be, for example, developing a charter or a protocol about what good community research in the area of race equality actually looks like. You know, so, you know, we can criticize, but then can we do a bit more than that? Can we actually say, well, you know, we're treated as lab rats at the moment, you know, but this is our vision of how democratic research can happen. And, you know, there are people in the university and processes that are receptive to that. So, for example, you know, there's an anti-racist steering group. I don't know if people are aware of this, but actually in the University of Bristol, there's an anti-racist steering group that's chaired by the provost, Judith Squires, and, you know, trying to make a difference but, you know, obviously with all of the challenges and difficulties that are involved in trying to change the culture of the university, but still, you know, there is an avenue there. There's a research committee that's part of the anti-racist steering group. If we could connect with that, you know, and present our vision of research based on what we agree as a community practice, you know, we might be able to get some purchase. If we can speak, there's an institute, I'm speaking about Bristol because that's the university that I know about because I work there. I don't know what the situation is at UE or other universities, but at Bristol, there's also something called the Brigstow Institute, which basically funds community research. That's its purpose. So, you know, if perhaps something that we can do as a community now, our group, is to work together rather than us academics coming and saying, look, you know, these are the problems that need to be researched, which is itself part of the problem. You know, that we create a space where our communities can say, well, actually, these are the issues that really matter to us. And then, you know, if we can find ways of working in through the academic links into the relevant structures and funding sources in the university, that seems to me something constructive we could do. Anyway, I'll be.
Sorry, I muted myself. Thank you, Leon. That was actually some of the issues of what I wanted to get at. And that idea of the co-creation of the charter is something, as an example, the Maasai used, right? So the Maasai did that to ensure that anthropologists in particular stop coming in and it's extracting. So they're very clear. And I believe also in Papua New Guinea as well, the indigenous population there. So there are some examples from indigenous groups from the African subcontinent in Australia, where they got tired of it, right? And they created these protocols. So I think it felt, looking for that, there are those mechanisms out there. I wanted to go to Desmond next, and then I also wanted to poke a little bit Richard, because Richard, you're the one that your whole job is just stats, right? Your whole job is just these numbers and data. So I'd be also interested to hear your perspective as well from the statistician purpose of, of us thinking about how do we play with these numbers and these data so that we get what we need, right, in a way that is fruitful. But Desmond, go ahead first, and then Richard, I want to kind of prompt you to come on in when you feel like it.
Thank you. I'm probably going to get booed now because I'm going to take another tack. It's really around this agenda and the trust issues. Data is overarching. We need the data. I think the apathy in some community is because research seems to be a recurring nightmare for communities, where what is the point of the research? I mean, as I mentioned before, the Stuart Hall Foundation, there are recommendations and findings. Last year we had a slew of reports. We had Public Health England, the Windrush, we had Doreen Lawrence's, we had the UN report, and it goes on to the Soil report. There are findings there, and I do think that to build that trust, and it's for researchers, in the benefit of researchers as well, is there need to be a pressure group that these findings and recommendations, something's done with them, because what is the point of the research? This is what communities will say. If I don't see measurable change or outcome, what am I doing? And we talked about long-term and short-term. If we talk about the Scarman report, that's a long time ago, and we still haven't got through a majority of those recommendations. And the recommendations for the last 20 years cover health, education, criminal justice, the list goes on, and the issues are still the same. So really, it's in the benefit of researchers as well to become a pressure group so that those findings and recommendations are pushed, that we don't start the cycle again of some more research into something else that communities will feel will never get anywhere. We have a list of recommendations that are relevant now. Why aren't we using those? So I just wanted to add that in there, because I think, to get around the communities, if you want the trust of the community, they need to see that there's measurable on the ground action so that they will trust the research is going to do something. Because at the moment, if I was to look at the government Sewell report, it crushes me, because we are now moving out of collecting data around this to this culture war. And so more than ever, this group is needed, because the government won't be doing research as we have had, and we will go backwards. So it's a challenge also to researchers that we need to get that trust. We need to be pressure groups so that some of the findings that research has done and reviews have done is implemented. Otherwise, communities won't trust in it.
Thank you. So Desmond, what I'm hearing you saying is basically you have to show in order to trust. So the community has to see measurable action to be able to trust that measurable action will be taken going forward. And so Richard, go ahead. Thank you, Desmond. Richard.
Thanks. I just wanted to offer a few observations about data, really inspired by the earlier discussion, some of the comments. I'm informed by many years' experience as a statistician. What I'm not going to do, if it's okay with you and everybody else, is not talk about cred. I think as a practicing civil servant, that would be not a smart career move on my part. So I'm responsible for the Ethnicity Facts and Figures website in the Race Disparity unit. And one of the things that we found when we were doing the user research to establish it 3 or 4 years ago was that we talked about adjusting for correlates, for factors that might be relevant to looking at particular outcomes. And the almost universal user reaction was, no, don't do that. Just give us the numbers, because the people we were speaking to didn't trust government, didn't trust statisticians to make those adjustments in a way that was equitable, even-handed, correct, and so on. They just wanted the raw data. So we did that. I've been working on a project the last 9 months or so, which has been around the impact of COVID-19 on ethnic minorities and other disadvantaged groups, but primarily ethnic minorities. And there's been a great emphasis from across the community, across different stakeholders, in making as many adjustments for correlated data as possible. So looking at the impact of deprivation, of course, looking at age and sex, that's kind of standard within health, but looking at deprivation, looking at population density and so on, to see how much those sorts of risk factors account for disparities in infection rates, death rates, and so on. And the reason we've been doing that is not to try to explain disparities away, explain the differential risks that some ethnic groups have been facing compared with the white group, for example. We're not trying to explain it away. What we're trying to do is understand what are the factors that have most impact. And we want to do that because if we know what factors are having most impact, we can try to do something about it. Now, admittedly, a risk factor like deprivation is not quick to address, but a risk factor like knowing that some occupations are inherently riskier than others, or that people living in multi-generational households face greater risks, they're things that can be addressed through physical measures like screens in taxis, or through communication to different groups, through prioritization of vaccines and so on. So we've had quite a different approach, and I don't know whether that's because the discussion about ethnicity data has matured considerably over the last 3 or 4 years. I think that's probably part of it. I think the Ethnicity Facts and Figures website and various things that have gone on in society have made conversations about race and ethnicity much more straightforward to have. They're complex discussions, and there's passion on all sides of the arguments, but the discussions can take place. So we felt fairly safe in being able to bring together information about those risk factors. It also strikes me that there's never a single correct interpretation of data. Once you go away from having pretty much a single number, I am 5'10", then everything else gets fought over by different people. So we shouldn't even pretend that there's a single version of the truth. There are different perspectives on data as there are different perspectives on everything else. I would reiterate early conversation about the importance of qualitative data. I'm a statistician by trade, so my instincts are always to go with the quants, with the hard numbers, but there are some aspects of information like individuals' travel patterns, their living arrangements, their compliance with the social distancing regulations and so on. That sort of information is always incredibly hard to identify through a kind of traditional statistical survey. Often you want to get beneath the surface about why people do or don't comply with social distancing, so you can understand what people's reservations are and what you might therefore do about it. So there is a real need for a sort of a mixed economy of different sorts of data. And I was struck by Heba saying about listening to communities, and it struck me that good data collection, quant and quali, is built up from communities, from individuals, but also there's a top-down element of it as well. And then there's a kind of a happy hourglass solution where one is designing data collections in a way that's providing the information that different groups need. And a final thought, a year ago, I knew nothing about epidemiology. One thing me and my team have found over the last year is that there are real specialist stakeholder communities in this. In addressing COVID-19, it's brought together government statisticians, it's brought together academics, epidemiologists, community organisations, local authorities, the media in many respects. All of these different groups have got different perspectives. They've also often got different, they speak different languages, they conceptualise issues differently. They don't always necessarily understand each other's perspectives. But what we found is that everybody has had, as you'd expect, a fairly shared commitment to the goal of minimising ethnic disparities in COVID-19 outcomes. So we've been able to overcome those differences and work together. And I think that speaks to the points made earlier about the importance of data ecosystems and infrastructures and relationships, because I've never been more conscious than over the last 6 months of the importance of that. It's not just about the numbers, although the numbers are vital. It is really about those relationships and about using those in ways that can build trust. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That's the last piece is something that I want to pick up on as we go forward. But Seydou, I know your hand was up as well. So before we continue, do you want to come in? And I might have caught her when she had to get off, and now I just called her out on accident on live. Okay, so we're gonna keep going, and when she comes back, there you go, Seydou. Do you want to? Your hand was up. Did you want to? Do you want to comment before we continue on?
Yes, I was just picking up and following up on Leon's point around the charter and what we might be able to take forward. And I think that's a really, really important point. And I think it's what this is about, because how do we develop an anti-racist framework for research from a community perspective, but also that can help and shape and change how research is undertaken across institutions. And I think on reflection in terms of BSWN, that has been the driving force consistently in terms of shifting. And I think they're the points that are being raised around, we all agree that we need data. We all agree that we need access to more research, but shifting the power more to communities so that you have able to have access not just to research, but also not how research is done, but what kind of research we do, because research is fairly informed. Just the way research is funded is fairly driven from academic institutions, but communities don't have a say. And I think communities and organizations also have ambition in terms of the research question and areas that we want to better understand and have data around. So I think the framework can really shape that. And I'm hoping the work of race is very much around that, that actually builds in the voice and purpose so that research has an impact. I think research is really powerful, but at the moment, something is not working. So I think that notion of a charter or framework, it's quite key. So I just wanted to comment when he was talking about that. It made a lot of sense from why we started this and some of the work that we've done with BSWN, hoping that it shifts and changes how research is done so that it can be more purposeful, because we need data, we need information. We're moving into a world that will be more data driven, but we have to play a role in that and have that ownership of control. So we're not just consuming it or being research, but we're active participants and we have control. So I just wanted to reinforce that in that.
Thanks, Seydou. And something that I'm picking up on as we're talking, we have about 20 more minutes left of this conversation, and I want to kind of shift over to really asking the panelists, what are some of the questions that actually interest you, so that we can start this process of thinking about what are the questions and where they're coming from. But before we get there, something that I want to connect to what Leon, Kalpna, Hebo, Richard said with the last what Seydou, and then Michael and Desmond have also brought in, is this idea of how do we build trust and building trust through the relationships, right? So building trust through relationship building and thinking about the infrastructure. But what happens when we're talking about hard numbers and data, what Richard pointed this out really clearly, is that when we have the numbers, sometimes or somehow the numbers matter more than the people, right? The numbers somehow tell us more than the people. This idea of science or the rational somehow being more important than the human and the lived. So as we're thinking about what Seydou just said, we're entering into a data-driven world. We're already here, but it's going to be more, right? We're going to everything is going to be technologically based, numbers based, into a data-driven base. Where do we then enter into and bring in that human component so we don't lose it even more? Do you see what I'm saying, y'all? So it seems as if over the years, over the decades, we have continuously lost the ability to be a human being, to actually see one another, to have the relationships, because we put on top of it these ideas of race, of class, of all those other things that put on top of it. And now we're going to be putting in more and putting it into a bubble of numbers and put a number of data. Where does the human come in so that as we're talking about race equality, as we're talking about the questions we're asking, right? Talking about building these relationships with one another on this session alone, right? And then expanding it out and bringing in, as somebody on the chat says, also bringing in relevant policymakers and decision makers to be part of this too, right? How do we do all this and not lose sight of the fact that it's about the relationship building to sustain and make the questions, and not just focusing on the data once again, so we don't reproduce the exact same thing we're trying to push back against. So I'm gonna leave it up there. So what do folks think about that? That's a lot of, I have a lot of musings, y'all. Y'all make me think. So what are you thinking about that? And just go ahead and jump out, whoever wants to speak.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, Saidu, go ahead.
Yeah, on the relationship leading to the question, I think that is key, but it comes down to power dynamics. So even shaping the research questions, I don't think community organizations get a chance because the research purpose, the research question, you get involved sometimes, but overall the purpose of the research has been decided. And I think we also have to understand institutions and how research is done, because it's driven by funding and different things. But I genuinely think the relationship is quite key. And also this notion of really understanding the role of community organizations and communities. If we accept that they have a powerful role, then we should really be committed. And there are places where it has worked in terms of the everyday integration. I think that's a really, really good model. Not perfect, but really, really good model of partnership working, of shaping the questions, but also discussing resources, because it's quite key. So again, how resources are shared. And I remember having a really, really long conversation between the partners and the university, negotiating way before the research bid. And there was a lot of time for doing that. And it ended up producing something really, really good. And I think that is fair and equitable, allows community organizations to participate comfortably, but also at the same time defining the purpose of the research. So I think it can be done, but it's very much based on the value that is placed. And I think we need to recalibrate that because often you will get an email, and I'm not saying all the time, but there are bad practice where you just get an email a day before a research bid goes in, and you're expected to give a letter of support, and it's been drafted even for you, which is quite annoying, and everything's been done for you, quite extractive. And almost, and I think sometimes from institutions, because of the power dynamic, and I don't want to sound too critical, because of the power dynamics, you're just seeing, you're going to say yes, but what am I saying yes to, right? You know, maybe I don't need the research. It's not relevant to me right now. You know, I don't need it. Just because it's around race, I don't have to say yes to everything race. You know, so I think sometimes just also having that respect and value to community partners. I don't think the same happens to business. I think corporates, maybe they're treated differently, but when it comes, you just feel and you feel like, no, I don't want to do that, and I don't care what the money is. So just that recalibration relationship is important, how you make people feel, how you engage. And I think that's quite key. I'll shut up. I have a lot to say. But I hope part of this race, what we're trying to do is change those practices and move us to a place, because I fundamentally believe in the notion of research, data, knowledge, and we should have access to that. But we just have to change our practices to a more equitable place. I'll shut up.
Thank you, Saidu. That gets in. Kalpana, go ahead, and then after Kalpana, Hibu.
Yes, echoing what Seda said, we've talked about equality, rebalancing, redressing the balance that exists. I think what you're asking, Nicole, is actually also, well, you know, if we have this trust and we have the research, well, what else is going to engage communities? What is going to empower communities? What's going to, you know, what else can we bring? And I think for me, it was very much about how do we instrumentalize this research for change, or this evidence that we have. That it becomes a power thing and a sharing of knowledge with communities as well, so that, you know, at the beginning you co-create that it is a genuinely co-produced, the questions are correct, the understanding is there, we know why you're doing it, but also what are we going to get out of it? And actually, even though the research may not, you know, research may end where it says actually, well, all we're doing is collecting data, that there is a sort of next step that can support people to say, well, actually, we can do something with this data for change, because there is, I'm really not sure about data for data's sake. We've got to get to that, and that will really be a way of empowering communities and communities seeing, but actually this is where it started from, and this is where actually it's going to go, and this is how I can use it to make a difference. Does that answer your question, Nicole?
It's getting there, yes, because it gets another side of it. Yes, completely. Hebo, we want to go ahead, and then after Hebo, Helen.
Thank you. So to answer your question, Nicole, in simple terms about you know, the human element, I would say if you you know, if you involve community organization, this will happen naturally. However, I do want to echo what Sada said. You have to first value the inputs and the insights of the community organizations, and you have to have them on board from the beginning, not one day before you know, the bid goes through, and also just to reiterate the fact that you know, the human element really, the stories that are being shared are, you know, is what gives a real substance to the research. You know, we work in samples, I live in samples, and just to say that, you know, it's a deprived area, and that's a very sort of general outlook. But if you were to sort of look closely to it and have a research that really wants to capture that human element, then that research will be much more beneficial, you know, for all parties.
Thank you, Helen, and then Michael. I'll speak what you wrote in here after Helen speaks.
Hi, I just quickly wanted to comment, I suppose, on the role of relationships in co-production in a slightly cautionary way, because it is absolutely essential, but too often what I see in co-produced projects is that relationships and reflections on those relationships take priority over outcomes that are important to community organisations, and that reflecting on those relationships can work as meaningful outcomes for academic purposes, but it means often that has come at the expense of the research that has been conducted being genuinely meaningful for the community organisations involved. And I think that a charter is a really interesting place to think about how we can address that directly and think about practical measures to intervene in that, to name that as a problem and think about how that we address that. And I just have one thing I wanted to say on funding. I feel utterly powerless to affect the way that funding comes into universities. And if we know that this is a system that is continuing to cause massive issues in the way that we can conduct research, how can we make that system work for us? If the funding comes down with a 5-day notice period, what can we do that means that we're able to fast track our partnerships so that they're still meaningful and equitable and co-produced, but within a timescale that we're being forced to put ourselves to work for, I suppose. I wonder if there's something that we could do about that if we can't do anything to change the funding system itself.
Thank you, Helen. That's good. It's good points to already put up, to put out there what the problems can be, so that it's already embedded in. It's a solution-based charter. So I think that having these conversations allow us to see these little things from different perspectives that we may miss, right? And now Michael also says that he believes that trust can be built by inclusion and transparency. Researchers should be willing to allow the participants feel that they are part of the process and provide the realistic outcomes of the research project itself. And so as we're winding down, we have about 10 minutes left. We've had a really good and rich conversation about what are some of the issues we have historically in the present day, what we mean when we talk about data, and what the data actually, both from collecting to disseminating to asking the questions, the whole process, right? What we talked about in terms of ecosystems, right, from the keynote speech, has allowed us to be able to push into and think about the relationships we have to be maintained, the trust that needs to be built, and the actual logistical problems that both sides run up against and how you navigate that. So now that we have that all there, and we have these last 10 minutes to think about as a group, I want to go back to the very first question I asked at the very beginning of this panel is, what are some of the questions that actually matter to you all? So what are the questions that you feel are the most pressing that need to be asked? What are some of the what are some of the actual data that you already know you have, right? That you feel has not been truly utilized in the ways that it could be. So I think if we can kind of think about the questions we actually want and the data we already think we have, that might be a great way to start the conversation of what you are actually trying to do for this race equality in terms of creating what seems to be the first iteration of is this kind of a charter. So what are the questions, and what are the questions you want to ask, and what are some of the data you already know is there that you feel could be engaged with to get some of these questions? And Seydou, I actually want to start with you since you were part of the development of this. What is for you, as somebody that's helping lead this, what is like a question or a main question or a concept that you are really truly interested in interrogating first?
I think Leon has his hand up. I'll come back later.
Oh, Leon, I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand.
No, it's absolutely fine. It's I can come in later. Let's prioritize Jada.
Yeah, in terms of from BSWN perspective, I think the question you're asking, Michelle, the question you're asking, Nicole, is very much around, it's why we're doing this. So I think for me, there is the question that we want to ask, but I think most importantly, it was around the approach. And it centers around how do we put community voices at the heart of research. It's what has really driven this, and the values and the principles of how research is undertaken. I think from a BSWN perspective, we have undertaken research ourselves. And I think we've been very, very lucky to have secured funding directly from funders who have funded our work around our specific research areas, whether it's around enterprise, whether it is around heritage and identity. It's very much driven by the need and where we're at, and that always shifts. So I don't think I can come up with a research question, but I think it's key around approach. And then second is, how do you make community organizations have access to research? And I think with the work, and Angelique will talk about towards the end, some of the pieces of work that we have, it's understanding where we have data gaps, and they exist, even from the race disparity audit. So how do we fill that gap? And most crucially is doing the research, but also how do we make research connect with policy and have an impact in terms of driving our work. And I think the partnership with the university significantly enhances that and helps that. And it's something that we're looking forward as we go forward to be able to drive that. So it's less about the question, but it's more around the approach and the purpose of what we want to achieve out of this, so that we have access to meaningful data, relevant, but also those questions around power, control, addressed and shifted and changed.
Perfect. Thank you, Seydou. And then Leon, do you want to contribute?
Sure, but I mean, do we want to prioritize community voices at this stage?
That's fine. I'm fine with that. I wanted to see if anybody else wanted to speak for the question. No? Leon, before you talk, there's one question that actually popped up as Seydou was talking that I think everyone actually is getting at a heart of something that we have kind of touched around, and that what everyone had speak about. Jessica asked, because we talked a lot of stuff, and we talked a lot about the issues and everything else. Her question is, how do you keep going? So when because it's very easy to get pessimistic in all of this. So we already know what's to do. You already have had this background. Seydou, at the end, Cloud, you answered the question was great. It's not about the question itself, but the approach in which we're trying to use to engage the issues, right? Mm-hmm. So then how do you all keep going? And I think that's a really important answer for people listening and young folks coming in and people trying to, getting into the struggle. What makes you keep going and not have a very pessimistic view of the work and what the outcomes can be?
Well, I mean, I can answer that from my perspective, and it's anger, really. In my area of education and race equality, that over all these years, it's still the case that if you're a Black boy in Bristol, not only are you more likely to underachieve at a national level, but you pay a double penalty for living in Bristol. You're even less likely to achieve if you live in Bristol. So it's that realization that fuels me, that you're more likely to go to prison than to university. I mean, that gets me up in the morning, as an issue, and it affects our Black girls as well. But I mean, going back to something that Desmond said earlier, I think it was Desmond, we know the answers to lots of this stuff. It's not new. There's been work going on about what an anti-racist school looks like for years. But you don't see it. We need to remind ourselves that there is hope, that there are examples of schools in my area in education that make a difference, that can make a difference. We need to understand. So I think there's something we can do as a group to disseminate what we already know, and to find ways of putting that evidence into practice, of demanding that our local authorities, that our academy trusts, that our head teachers do something with this information, because it's not new.
Thank you. Arathi, you wanted to also comment?
Yeah. Just thank you so much, Nicole. Just on that question of, how do you keep going, and bouncing off of what Leon said, where there's anger, but there's also hope. And I think what I wanted to add to that is also that our lives aren't defined through only through fights against white supremacy and white domination, right? There's also joy and flourishing and creativity. And I think it's also holding on to those bits. And so whilst all of these conversations have importantly been trying to understand, to try to track data and lived experience, part of those lived experiences are also those that what makes community, right? And I don't want to sound too kind of romantic about that, but actually that is sustaining. And I think we do need to hold onto that, the food, the friendships, the joy, the laughter, and all of that. It's not just, and that is a political act, because it is pushing back against deficit framings of communities. So that's just what I wanted to add.
Thank you. And Kalpana, I know you have something to say about that too. So come on in, Kalpana.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, it's about what wakes us up is we are human beings and we believe in humanity, and we believe in, despite the crap, that we can try and make a difference. And because we are, particularly all of us in communities, I mean, you know, when I'm with my group, I feel a responsibility. I want to make a difference. I want everybody to thrive, and I'll find a way of doing that. And despite everything I've said today, which is, you know, might feel like actually the institutions are crap and need, well, institutions do need a lot of help, but that we do have our allies, and you know, and I sit here and I know that there are allies that I can go to and who get what I'm saying, so that really helps too. You know, you have a choice, I think, in life. You either sort of, you know, say that's it, can't do anything, despite everything that's coming at you, or you think I've got to make it, you know, I can do something here, and some of those things can be small and some of those things can be big, and it is these interactions. It's your remembering your humanity, remembering what you can do, knowing that you can do more. I don't mind being a thorn in the side of anybody, you know, those. And I think also for me, it's generational. It's also, I think, you know, that's it. I'm not going to, you know, I'll stay working for a while, but I just look and I think, well, what are we building here? You know, because we've seen this cycle for a long time. You know, you know, I grew up when the National Front were around. We've seen all this. You know, do we really want this to perpetuate? Don't we have a responsibility around that too? And you know, we talk about young boys and girls, and we just think, well, actually, why can't the outcomes be better for them? We've got to try and do that, and that's what really keeps me going. But every time I'm with my community groups, I look at people and I think, actually, we have to work together on this. Everybody deserves this, and so it's worth all the hassle.
Thank you, Kalpana. And then lastly, Desmond, we're hitting 8:51. So can you do it in a minute or less?
I'll try.
Okay.
Yes. So, I mean, what gets me up in the morning is I work with young people who are marginalized, excluded, involved in serious youth violence or criminal child exploitation or CSE. And, you know, I'm 51. I've lived through, as Kalpana has said, you know, I remember coming home with spit in the back of my afro when I had hair as a child. I remember, you know, the gaslighting and the you know, the microaggressions in school, and even worse than that, you know, just walking adults screaming racial slurs at me coming home from school. So I've lived through that, and what gets me going was, you know, there was a long piece of apathy that I had where I was tired of fighting. And then for me, it was when Judah Dunby got tased in the face, the 63-year-old grandfather. And it really struck me that, is this what our full life comes to? You know, that at 63, that you could be treated that way. And I really believe that that wouldn't have happened if he was a white 63-year-old man, that he wouldn't have been treated that way. So that really got me going. And then seeing that our young people are suffering through identity crises, just what's happening to them in the school system, that they are pushing away from, disengaging. And so that's what gets me up in the morning. It's really that there is a fight on it, and we have the tools to deal with it. I think this is so great, that we can do something about it. And if not us, who? And if not when? If not now, when? You know, so that's really it. We need to take the role, and it's up to us to do something about it.
Thank you, Desmond. And thank you, Jessica, for that question, because I think it was a great way to end, so that it's not always, again, just deficit, but we're understanding what we're doing here and why. So before we close that, I want to turn it over to both Seydou and Angelica, who are going to talk about some of the projects that RACE are doing right now and ways in which you all can be a part of this. Right, Seydou? So I'm going to turn it over to them, and then we will close it out.
Yeah, I will let Angelique share that, and then I can give the final closing remarks if you need me to.
Perfect.
Problem. Yes, I'm just going to discuss just very briefly just some of the projects that we have been working on so far at RACE, just to bring this, down to a more sort of practical level, and just what we've been up to since we started the coalition. So in 2019, we carried out a project looking at the government's race disparity audit data, looking at the ethnicity facts and figures. And what this highlighted is that there were significant gaps at the regional and local level. And also problems with the data available. So from there, we've been working with the University of Bristol through the Bristol Model, which aims to sort of connect undergraduate students to research projects with the local community. And so we've taken on 3 placement students in this project. So Lottie, Mariah, and Toby, who are listening in today, they've been working hard on these projects and are actually with us. So they're with us today and have been running some of our live tweets as well. So the first of the project is that they're looking at the local and regional data sources. So from Bristol City Council, for example, from the West of England Combined Authority, to understand what data is being held, in what form, and what those gaps are. So our analysis will be made public and added to our data hub, which is on our website. I think Saffron will post a link to our website just in the chat in just a moment. So part of this project is to make data more accessible, because so a key race objective involves ensuring that regional race equality data is made available to those who need it in ways which are valuable to them. So this leads us on to one of the other projects that we're working on, which is focused on mapping the race equality space in the city, so the sort of ecosystem, if you will. So it aims to sort of offer a positive contribution to many race equality initiatives that are ongoing in Bristol and the wider region. So at present, our understanding of the nature of and the relationships between these initiatives is quite limited. So through this project, we're working with colleagues at Bristol City Council, for example, to map the multi-agency groups, the overarching sort of groups. So for example, the Race Equality Strategic Leaders Group. So we're mapping those, and as well as the sort of spaces that allow for these groups to come together. So the race, the race gathering, the city gathering, for example. Another aspect of this is to geographically map the race equality organizations in the city and the Southwest. And this will enable us to sort of provide a comprehensive picture of the nature of the work being undertaken by local organizations. And again, part of this is to establish where we might help plug those data gaps, which operate as sort of barriers to this work. We'll explore some of the data needs of local race equality organizations and also their preferences regarding the ways in which that data should be provided to them. So we'll provide a lot of that data. A lot of that data is immediately available via via our website. But just very quickly, I know there is 3 minutes left. But Nicole, if I could just share my screen for just a moment, and I'm just going to show you just very quickly the mapping that is already taking place. If I can, there we go. So this is just bear in mind that this is just the starting point, and we'll make this publicly available, but just so that you're aware of some of the work that we're already undertaking. So this is one of the projects that our placement students are working on at the moment. So we'll be creating, as I said, a geographical map of the city and of the wider region of the race equality space, as I said. So for example, you'll be able to zoom in, and it'll show all the organizations working in the race equality space. From there, you'll click on one. It'll give you the details on the left-hand side of where they are, who they are, what work they're carrying out, and provide links to those organizations. You'll also be able to filter by geographical area. So for example, by St. Paul's, and you'll also be able to filter by the area of work that they're in. So for example, are they working in adult social care? Are they working in housing, etc.? But as I said, this is just a starting point. I just wanted to give you a brief idea of what it might look like in the end. And I will stop there and I'll hand over to Sada, who will finish us off for the day.
Thanks, Angelique. I think I just want to say thank you so much for giving up your time. Really, really good discussion, really, really good point. This is a beginning, and I think it's wonderful that we've got to this point. We've been working on this for the last 4 years to just take it off the ground. So now we're here. But the commitment is from BSWN's perspective, and I can genuinely say we're just leading on this, we're facilitating, but it will be informed by yourself in terms of what you need, how you want it to be, and how we take this forward. At the heart of this is how do we democratize research and data, and that means different things. And I think they're really good points that have been raised. And we've captured those points, the notions of power, transparency, community, all of those things we will have to unpack. If we have to develop an anti-racist framework, then it has to come from a place that incorporated diverse voices. And there will be a further discussion for us to really understand in developing those principles that we want to put forward, and we'll agree. So we'll come back to you with anything that we develop. I hope this will be a collaborative approach. Ourselves and the university, we're just leading on this, but it is a collective initiative. I hope you will continue to engage, give us your feedback, and also I hope it goes both ways. The heart of this is making this work for you. So please shape it as much as possible, be honest as possible, be critical as possible. That's the only way that we'll develop something meaningful. But I just want to say thank you so much again. We will synthesize the information from this, come back to you, and hopefully you can shape what race is going to be that will make a difference and respond to some of the challenges that you've raised.